My name is Daniel Coggins. I'm here with Creator Teen Press. With me is my colleague,
Aaron Capato.
and today we're interviewing a very special guest. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Pamela Yates.
Well, it's nice to meet you, Pamela.
Nice to meet you too.
Nice to meet you too.
All right, I'm gonna hand it off.
There we go.
Right on. All right, I'm gonna hand it off to Aaron to ask the first question.
So when you started filming When Mountains Tremble, 30 years later, did you ever expect to nail Rios Monte like as like ever take him to trial or anything like that? Was that your goal filming the movie, or were you just there to like bring awareness to what was happening in Guatemala?
Yeah, I was really there to find out what was happening, to investigate, and bring the story back. I never imagined that 30 years later, what I filmed in 1982 would be used as forensic evidence in a genocide trial. But that being said, at the time I filmed it, General Rios Montt was at the height of his power, and no one could actually have imagined that he would fall from power or that he would fall so far from power, that he would one day be detained and jailed and tried and convicted for genocide.
During the trial, once at the end, when you heard the verdict, like what were your feelings towards that? Like, were you excited for, like, knowing that your film helped put this man away for all the crimes he did?
Yeah, I felt very satisfied that I was able to contribute my granito de arena, my tiny grain of sand, for positive social change. It was an exhilarating moment. It really was. And all of the people that had spent 30 years on a quest for justice were vindicated, and they had a reckoning at that moment. So actually, I think it was one of the high moments, one of the high points in the history of human rights, because this was the first trial for genocide against indigenous people anywhere in the world. And there have been a lot of genocides.
Yeah.
But the Guatemalans were the ones who built this case and brought him to trial.
Um, I was reading online, and you're from Pennsylvania, correct? And it was you grew up in a mining like area. Did you ever expect yourself to go from such like a small place in Pennsylvania to going to Guatemala to fight some big general guy, and then like like how did you get from Pennsylvania all the way to Guatemala, and filming all these amazing movies about genocides?
Well, I'm from an Irish American enclave in a coal mining region of Pennsylvania. So it was a very poor region economically, but very rich in culture. And the richness of the culture was in its storytelling ability. So the better the storyteller you were, the more popular you were in town. And my father was a great storyteller. So I like to think that telling filmic stories is carrying on the storytelling tradition. So that's really the thread that connects me to my background and took me to Guatemala. I've made films in many parts of the world. It's just that the work in Guatemala has been sustained. It's 35 years. It's 35 years. It's three films. It's one story. Um, I, for some reason, when I was very young, I was working for a newspaper as a photojournalist, and there was a Puerto Rican migration moving up the Connecticut River Valley into Massachusetts, and nobody on the newspaper spoke Spanish. So I decided to go to Mexico to learn Spanish. And sort of in my youthful hubris, I thought I could learn Spanish in 2 months. But I stayed for 2 years, and I covered a lot of stories then, and that started my connection with working in Latin America. And now I'm really glad I learned Spanish, because Spanish is such an important language to speak in the United States and throughout the world. And I feel really connected to Latinos and Latino culture in the United States too.
All right, so you said that you had learned Spanish, and it really helped you with the whole getting across to the Guatemala people and stuff. Do you have a quote in Spanish that you could share that could help represent the story that you were telling?
Sure. Yo solamente quiero poner mi granito de arena.
And could you say that in English now?
Yeah. I just want to add my tiny grain of sand. It's a Mayan concept that means that each of us have something small, a tiny grain of sand to contribute to positive social change. It's a phrase, it's a saying that I learned when I was making When the Mountains Tremble, my first film in 1982, and it's a concept that I've carried with me throughout my filmmaking life. And it's a concept that I want people to come out of these films thinking about. Like, what is your tiny grain of sand? What is your tiny grain of sand? What is our tiny grain of sand to really create social change?
Yeah. So there's like speaking about that. In our class with Rogan, he's one of those kind of people that really wants to have us make an influence on the world. You know, to be successful. And there's some things like being successful. There's people that you know or opportunities that you have. Is there anything like that that you thought that helped bring you to where you are right now?
I think meeting Rigoberta Menchú when I made When the Mountains Tremble was really key and seminal in how I developed as a filmmaker. So, Rigoberta Menchú is the protagonist of When the Mountains Tremble, and I met her when I was making the film, and she became the storyteller in the film. She tells her story directly to the camera. She was 22 years old, a young Mayan living in political exile from Guatemala. Um, the film helped put her on the world stage. And 10 years later, she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, the first indigenous woman, the first indigenous person to be awarded that prize. So I think our relationship and our interplay and our interactivity, and she's in all three of the films of the Resistance Saga, have really been a great model for me.
While filming While the Mountain Trembles, I know I've read in other interviews that you were worried about your safety, and then your other people that were there filming the movie with your safety. But were you ever worried? Like, did you make connections with any people? And then when you had to leave after making the film, were you worried about their safety and like what else was gonna happen during that time?
You know, I always focus much more on the safety of the people who are in front of the camera than the people behind the camera, because usually we are the people who can leave. We come and we go, but the people who are in the film run the greatest risk. And usually the people who are in the film are very conscious of that risk. And we talk it over sometimes beforehand. I want to make sure that they're sure that they want to be in the film and say what they want to say. Sometimes what people say is so controversial that I get back in touch with them before I release the film or show them parts of the film and make sure it's still okay with them, because ultimately the safety and security of people are central. But you know, a lot of times people want to be courageous and they know that courage breeds courage. So if they're courageous, then we're going to be courageous, and it'll be like a ripple effect throughout society.
Um, During the trial, I remember in an interview you said that the people that were there, the people from Guatemala, the Mayans were there. Do you remember the song that they started singing at the end of the trial?
Yeah, they started to sing a song about what it means to be human. The what happened was the judge declared Rios Montt guilty and said that he was going to be taken to prison. But there was a lot of chaos in the courtroom, and she was afraid that Rios Montt was going to flee and become a fugitive. So she had the courtroom doors locked, and she asked everybody to stay inside the courtroom. And everybody stayed in their seats, but they started to sing. And it was a really beautiful song. And it made us remember all the people who had died, who had been sacrificed as a result of the genocide. And people were moved and crying and all together.
Do you think these movies have had a bigger impact outside of Guatemala and have brought attention to other genocides in the world?
I think that's true. I think it's had a really big effect inside Guatemala, too. These kind of effects are very hard to measure, though. We only know from anecdotes that people tell us about it. But I know that a lot of people, especially, have seen When the Mountains Tremble, and it's really set them on their path to what they want to do in life. So that's also very satisfying for a documentary filmmaker.
Um, then while filming When the Mountains Tremble, did you go in expecting to go a certain path, and did you lead to any other paths that you weren't expected to go to while filming it?
I'm not exactly sure what you mean.
So like, did you go in with the idea of filming like what was going on, and did you have like did you end up somewhere else than what you expected to film?
Oh, well, I expected to be able to talk to all members or all groups across the political spectrum in Guatemala. But when I got there, nobody would talk to me. Everybody was too afraid. The military wouldn't talk to me. I couldn't get in touch with anybody from the guerrilla insurgents, and people in civil society were just too afraid. So I thought I was a total failure, and this is my first film. So I'm never going to be a filmmaker. What I decided to do was have a lot of patience and stay there for a really long time and try to build relationships of trust with people. And those relationships of trust ultimately led me to being able to go much more deeply into sectors of society across the political spectrum. After 6 months, we had filmed everything for When the Mountains Tremble, and I left.
Okay, so when you were saying that when you first had started, the government and the military, they were afraid to speak with you, do you think that had anything to do with the fact that you were a woman and kind of in that time?
Yeah, they weren't afraid to speak to me because they were in power. They just didn't take me seriously. And so I'm sure that partially had to do with my being a woman, but also my being a woman and not being taken seriously. Once I got access, um, they, you know, all the obstacles fell away. So that was a good thing. And I always think you have to use your greatest weaknesses as your greatest strengths. So if somebody sees that that's a weakness, that you're a woman or you can't do things as well as men can, well, how am I going to use that? Yeah, I'm going to use that to get more access. And I'm going to use that to do the best job that I possibly can. Or another really good example of that is we don't have millions of dollars to make films like the Hollywood films, right? But we use ingenuity and creativity with the resources we have, sometimes to make something better. So that's another way of using our greatest weakness as a strength. The military, the way that I cracked that was that even though they wouldn't talk to me, I went down to the Air Force Base and I talked to the soldiers on guard outside. We shared cigarettes. Then the soldiers introduced me to their sergeant. Ultimately, the sergeant introduced me to his colonel. And then the colonel introduced me, this is after a couple months, okay, to the head of the Guatemalan Armed Forces, General Benedicto Lucas Garcia. And while I was doing an interview with him, I convinced him to let me go with him on a mission. And so that began my access to the military. Just a question of talking to people, building a relationship of trust, and going the next step wherever possible.
Along the way, I'm sure there were some challenges that you faced and that you've overcome. But you being a woman as a filmmaker, there's not very many women out there who do filmmakers or direct films. Is there any like challenges that you might have faced that relate to that?
Actually, in the documentary genres, there are a lot of women directors. And so that's really good, much more so. We're much more diverse, gender-wise, and in every other way in documentary filmmaking. And I think that's a really good trend. I think that's very good. You know, 4 of the 5 films that were nominated for documentary Oscars this year were directed by African Americans. So, yeah, Oscars not so white. Okay, so really big challenges I've faced as a woman. I think I could have made a lot more films. You know, if I had had the opportunity and the resources, I could have made a lot more films. And so I'm very happy with the films that I've made. And each film that I make, I do a multi-year outreach and engagement campaign. But it's a hard struggle, and I could have made a lot more films.
So you helped resolve some issues with the whole genocide and the government. Do you have any plans to maybe go elsewhere to help resolve issues in other countries?
Yeah, you know, I make films in a lot of countries. Actually, I made a lot of films in the United States, too. Not a lot, but, you know, I have a body of work here. Mostly about poverty, questioning why there's poverty in the United States, the richest country in the world, and following poor people's movements to change that. And I've also made films about the violent white right, like the Ku Klux Klan and the Nazi Party in the United States. But Guatemala wrapped its arms around my soul and never let me go. And so I think I'm going to do my next film here in the United States. I think it's time to do one here. I think it's important. I think it's critical. And wow, this is this is an incredible country with a lot of stories to be told.
Yeah, there definitely is a lot of stories with the whole civil rights and the LGBT. Recently in North Carolina, there was the transgender law that they were trying to pass. Um, there's just a lot of issues with women's rights and all these other things. I definitely agree with you on that there should be some more voicing and support to help get a resolution to those answers or to those issues.
Yeah. But I'm going to spend the next year actually traveling around with the trilogy of films about Guatemala, which we're calling the Resistance Saga. And we're going to partner with local groups in resistance in the cities that we land in. So this is really meant because the films are about Guatemala, but in all our films, we try to tease out the universal values of justice, of racism, of defense of the land, and of indigenous rights. And those can be talked about and shared in so many ways, in so many places. I mean, just this last year, we're now so much more cognizant of water rights, water protectors, earth guardians, and certainly Standing Rock and the Standing Rock Sioux have been at the forefront of that.
So you think by taking your movies elsewhere to other people, you're kind of like seeding resistance around different places.
I think like strengthening resistance,
Yeah.
right? Because it's already there. So it's just building networks of solidarity.
So you said you wanted to make your next film is going to be in America. Do you think it's going to be easier to, since you're already a big filmmaker here, do you think it will be easier for you to gain more trust from other people and be able to film more other stuff than in Guatemala?
You know, being a known filmmaker has its pluses and its minuses. So the pluses is yes, maybe you can get better access, but the minuses are that people who may be corrupt, may be doing illegal things, may be destroying the environment, they're not going to want to talk to you. And so it's, you know how I said use your greatest weakness as a strength? Well, I think that emerging filmmakers also have that strength. We're always looking for what's emerging, what's up and coming, who are going to be the next really interesting documentary filmmakers or journalists. And so you all have that as a plus.
So we're gonna be wrapping it up real quick here. Would you have any advice to maybe some like us as journalists to help come to fix these issues that are coming more prevalent in today's society? Do you have any advice for that?
Sure. When you go in to do an investigation, you have to have a concept of what you're investigating and where it might go, but you also have to be really open minded and make your investigation a journey of discovery.
Okay, I greatly appreciate that. I just want to thank you for your time
Thank
and
you.
giving us the opportunity to ask you these questions.